And we're back. You're listening to the Talking Boxing with Billy C show. Glad you could join us. And if you don't visit our website, you're missing out on a lot of stuff. www.billycboxing.com is the place to go for all your updated boxing news. And you can get directly to our YouTube page and our podcast and all that stuff right on the front page. www.billycboxing.com. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter. It's at Talkin Boxing. That's TalkinBoxing. There's a good book out right now, and it's right up my alley. It's called The Real Rockies. It's right here in my hand. And basically it tells the story of Italian-American boxers, which, when we're talking about the history of this sport, there's always an Italian fighter that we're talking about from back in the day. They were so common in the sport. Well, this book focuses on the golden age of boxing and the involvement of the Italian fighter between 1900 and 1955. And joining me right now is the author of this book, Rolando Vitale. What's up, Rolando?
How you doing, Billy?
Not too bad. I'm glad you had some time with us today, and I'm sorry that it took so long for us to get you on. But I'm real glad you're here, man.
No problem. Thanks for having me on your show.
This book, and I have it in my hand for everybody that's watching right now. I love it. I got a few questions for you. First and foremost, what made you do this book? I mean, what drove you to isolate just the Italian fighters of an era that I constantly fall back on all the time? 1900 to the mid-50s is when they all roamed the boxing scene, all the Italian fighters. What made you do this project?
Well, I've always been a boxing fan. I mean, my father was a boxing fan who loved the Italian fighters. But when I worked as a journalist for a London weekly newspaper, I had the privilege of meeting Denny Mancini, who is an icon of the British boxing. He was a cut man, trainer, international matchmaker, and his uncle himself was a world-ranked lightweight boxer back in the late 20s. And my associations with him were professional to start off with, but we got talking, and being both from Italian background, he was always annoyed and irritated at the fact that so many Italian fighters were never given the credit that they deserved. And the thing that really used to anger him was the fact that apart from Marciano LaMotta, because of the films, and LaMotta and Graziano because of the Hollywood films, and Marciano's unbelievable 49-0 record, not many people could actually know more than 4 or 5 fighters of Italian American background from that golden age. So he basically said to me, why don't you write the book that hasn't been written? And initially I thought, okay, that's going to be difficult with work, family commitments, but it was something that drove me on. And initially it began as a dissertation project at university, and then I decided to immerse myself in the project wholeheartely and managed to get the book out.
You make an interesting point, because you're right. The Italian fighters didn't get a lot of credit, and my next question is kind of right along that line, and maybe it could be part of the answer, and I hope you have the answer for me. Why did so many of these guys change their names? I mean, that could be one of the reasons that they don't get the recognition, because, a lot of these Italian fighters went, I mean, I even know there's several that changed their name to Irish names, just so that they could get fights and stuff. Why did they change their names? Why were they forced to change their names so much?
Well, the majority, I think you hit a very good point. I mean, one of the reasons why I don't think the general public and the mainstream, and even people within boxing, are unfamiliar with the Italian-American success is purely because they changed their names mainly to Irish names and English. There's a multitude of reasons as to why each individual fighter chose to change their name. I mean, some some changed their names because they didn't want their mothers to know that they were actually in a violent sport, and so they didn't want to upset mama. But the main point, and especially this is what comes out through the research, is you got to remember, Billy, back in the the 1900s and 10s and 20s, right through to the Depression, Italians were seen as a second. You only have to look at the biggest lynching in American history happened to the Italian American people, the New Orleans lynching of 1891. And then you have the educated elites and even government spokespersons at the time, calling Italians as biologically incapable. Italians were criminals, tramps. You name it, and everything was being thrown at the Italian American. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, every other ethnic group had it tough in their own way. But the Italian American, at the time that they were successful as boxers, troubled times produced, tough men. And as I say, they were, a lot of them were forced to change their names because it was also a form of trying to assimilate, trying to appease the promoters and the managers. And don't forget, a lot of the patrons back then, in the early part of the 20th century, were mainly, Irish and, white Anglo-Saxon, people of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant background. And, so the promoters felt it was a good thing for the Italians to change their name in order to get a place on the boxing card, and a lot of Italians willingly acquiesced in that. But these are some of the reasons. But there were others. I'll give an example, like Sammy Mandel and Benny Yanger. Benny Yanger was a formidable contender and also a title claimant in the 1900s. He had a Jewish manager, and he felt it was a good idea, being out of Illinois, to try and capture the Jewish fan base. And so he switched his name. His real name was, well, it depends which source you read, but his real name was Benjamin Angona, or Frank Angona, depending on the source. But he changed his name to Benny Yanger. And the same thing happened to Sammy Mandel, the great lightweight, during the 20s. The management felt it was a good idea to try and capture the huge Jewish fan base in the Chicago, Illinois area. So, it really depends on the type of area. There's a lot of reasons, Billy, a lot of reasons. But the main one was, I think it was the assimilation. The Italian was seen as a second-class citizen. He was seen as an outcast of society, and it was a way of trying to keep your head low, trying to make a living through the toughest of sports.
Yeah, it's so true. My grandparents are from Italy, and were from Italy, and in order for my grandfather to even get a job, his name was Mario, and when they came over here to the States, he had to change his name. People don't realize how, at least here in the States, how prejudiced people were against the Italians. And it wasn't that long ago, and it gets shoveled right under the carpet. People don't even think it ever existed. And, your book, at least in my mind, brings it out and shows that's it. Another great fighter that always comes to mind about changing names is Lou Ambers. His last name was like Ambrosia, something like that. And
Ambrosio.
Ambrosio. And he changed his name to Lou Ambers just so he could be competitive, to get opportunity. So, and the list goes on and on. And that brings me to my next question. Why do you think that really, for the most part, during this era that you picked, that 50 some odd years that you chose to pick out these fighters, they actually, when push comes to shove, were the dominating fighters in the sport of boxing. The Italian fighters from 1900 through 1955, for the most part, were the guys. Maybe they weren't the most popular named fighters, but they were the ones that were fighting in crosstown rivalries, fighting the same opponents several times, developing their own fan following. It was like they promoted themselves. Why were they able to do this versus some of the other ethnic fighters?
I mean, again, I think there's various factors at play here, but I think it's a really difficult. It's a very good question, very difficult to answer. I think one of the things is that because Italians took a lot longer to actually make it in America, compare the Italian progress, American progress, we say, and compare that to the Jewish cohort. By 1940, the Jewish American cohort had already assimilating and had used education as a vehicle out of the ghetto, out of poverty. And so, many Jewish American kids went to university, went to college. They found a way, an alternative method in which to sort of leave the sport of boxing behind. I mean, if you look at the 20s, the Jewish American cohort was just as dominant. Some would argue more dominant than the Italian cohort, although statistically speaking, Italians won more titles than the Jewish American cohort in the 20s. But by 1940, Billy, I think you're going to struggle to name me one Jewish fighter that was a contender, because most of them had left. They had left the sport of boxing and had found easier ways to earn a living, whereas the Italian found it a lot longer. He struggled for a lot longer, whether it was a language issue, whether it was a cultural issue. I mean, there was a number of factors that were working alongside that took time for them to find a way out of the ghetto. But once they actually found, for example, after the Second World War, there were a number of the GI Bill. There was a lot of initiatives that enabled youngsters to go to college. There was a greater emphasis on university education. What you find is that the Italian gradually moves out of boxing, and that subsequently the decline happens. I mean, so much so that by 1958, if memory serves me right, 15% of the professional boxers in America were only Italian American, and that subsequently explains why from say 55, 56 onwards you're struggling to name too many champions. I mean, yeah, of course you had people like Carmen Basilia who carried on fighting in the into the 60s. You had Willie Pastrana, who won the title, the light heavyweight title, in the early 60s. You had Joey Jardello, but these were all guys that belonged, in my opinion, to the last wave of the golden era. But what you had a lot of young Italians who ended up going into baseball, which had began with the Joe DiMaggio effect. A lot of people went into baseball, and just as many Italian Americans, physically strong Italian Americans, went into American football. And so as the boxing, Italian American participation in boxing declined, then there you had the escalation of participation in baseball, and especially in American football. So I think that's relevant, but also because the Italian American lived in, should we say, in the inner city enclaves for a lot longer. And boxing, as you know, many of the clubs were on street corners in neighborhoods, in every street corner in neighborhoods back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And if social mobility was a problem, as it was, you had guys living and youngsters growing up in these neighborhoods for a lot longer. And, their image of success was usually when they saw a boxer walking down the street. Now, he could have been a champion, he could have been a contender, or he may well have been a headliner. But it was like success bred success. But soon as there was an alternative way to get ahead, the Italians took it.
Yeah, and that's that unfortunately that continues today, not just with Italians, but with a lot of young athletes that could potentially be superstar fighters today are choosing these other opportunities, like you mentioned, American football, baseball, basketball, etc. the times have changed and the opportunities is better because of the leagues and the sport of boxing itself has changed a lot too since that era, at least the 50 years that we're talking about. But
Absolutely.
anyway, one of my best parts, your book is great, but I got to be honest, the best part that I like about it is you put all the appendices in there, over 300 pages for everybody that's watching and listening right now. He's got over 300 pages right here in his book that is dedicated to the names and records and brief stories on all these fighters. I mean, I love that. I mean, there's guys there, that all the information is there. My question about that is, were there names that didn't make the list, or is this pretty much a full list that you have in the book? Are there names that you excluded for a certain reason?
When you say names, are you actually specifically referring to the list of Italians who boxed using Irish and Anglicised names? Because I included over 1,200 Italian-American prize fighters who fought during that period, who used Irish and Anglicised names. Is that what you're referring to, or you're referring to all of the appendices that I included?
Well, what I'm saying is you have such an extended list of all these guys that were Italians, whether they used an Italian name or went a different route, using a Jewish name or whatever. My question to your knowledge, mm-hmm. Are there fighters that didn't make the cut for one reason or another? I mean, is this an accurate number to suggest that these were all the fighters, or are these the ones that you were able to just track down?
What I can say is that it took me a very long time to track down all the fighters that I included in the book. I mean, as you see, I've done I section them off where I've done thumb sketches and biographies on the champions and title claimants, and then I actually list the fighters with the Italian American fighters who boxed under Irish and Anglicised pseudonyms. But what I found, it's as complete a project as I could have done, because it took me 10 years on and off to put it all together. But as I've made contacts and I've put the feelers out over the last year or so, since the book came out, I've subsequently found another 35 guys who I wasn't able to find whilst I was doing the research. And don't forget, I came to America 3 times. I even went to Hank Kaplan's archive when he lived in Miami, and I managed to get as much information from him as I could. And as you know, Hank was one of the greatest historians that ever lived. And my travels took me to the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, which has one of the best sports archives, and I managed to get as much information from there as I could. I think they're called the Joyce Sports Archives at the University of Notre Dame. And it took me a long time to collate all this information. I went through the old publications of the National Police Gazette, which was the big it was the big newspaper, popular culture newspaper in America from the 1890s right through to 1920s. And boxing was an integral part of that newspaper. I went through every conceivable publication you can think of in order to compile this list. And so, for all your listeners and viewers who are interested in boxing in general, but especially if you want to know more about the Italian American contribution and success within the sport during this era, you don't have to go looking for it from sources. It's all contained in one book. So I think from that point of view, I think that's it's, when I put the book together, it was the most comprehensive thing I could have done over that 10-year period. But as I say, the research continues, Billy. So and if I find more names, if I find more data, then who knows? Sometime in the near future, I will most probably do a revised edition, because it's a historical. I'm sure you'll agree. It's a historical reference book. It's I've added the historical and sociological dimension to the sports story. I've just given it the framework, and then I've written the story about the Italian American contribution and success within boxing during that period.
It's definitely extensive. I think is an understatement. And
Thanks,
yes, I've gotten. I had the luxury of meeting Hank Kaplan before well before he passed away, and he helped me with things too. I mean, the guy was phenomenal, and I'm glad to hear that you had an opportunity to meet with him, because he was a wealth of information. That's for sure. And I tell you what I enjoy, and obviously we don't want to give too much away so people buy the book, but what I enjoy is that this book to me shows that I think the Italians really should get more credit than what they do, for not just for their individual accomplishments, but for the sport itself. I really think that they were a foundation for the success during that era, which is arguably the most popular era in the sport of boxing, is the years that you have covered between 1900 and 1955. And another thing that, I gotta just, give you credit for. I mean, how do you expect to find fighters when they were able to hide their names from mom? If mom didn't even know that they were fighting, I mean, how are you supposed to find it? So even Rocky Marciano didn't tell his mother for the longest time, about that. But one last question I got for you is, what was the most enjoyable part? I know that, we said when we first started chatting that you had some inspiration and stuff, but as the project went on, and I put out a book, obviously not as extensive as yours, but there were times when it was rough, times I was happy, sometimes I wasn't so happy, but there was a time when there was an exciting part for me when I was writing my book. What was the most enjoyable and exciting part for you during this process before it came to life from the publisher? I mean, what would you say the most enjoyable part of doing this book was for you?
Definitely, for me, the best part of it was the research, the compiling of the data. I found that I found it enlightening. I found it interesting. I mean, every time that I headed to the libraries, the respective libraries, whether it be the newspaper library in London, or whether it be in America when I was at the Joyce Library, or I even went to the New York Public Archives. I spent like a month and a half there. For me, it was just going through. To a lot of people, it might sound as if it was a laborious process. Yes, it was, and it was exhaustive. But every time, the mission was to find these fighters and to learn more about them. And when you uncovered their true identity, for me, it was like piecing, putting all the pieces in a jigsaw, and knowing that one day I'll be able to publish this story for a lot of people to read and understand and appreciate, how phenomenal the actual Italian American contribution to the sport of boxing was. And so, it was actually finding these nuggets of information that were buried in tomes of archives. I mean, it was just incredible. Example, I mean, there was a fighter back in the 1900s called Tommy Daly. He was a contender. He was like if memory serves me right, I think he was a featherweight stroke lightweight, and he boxed out of New York, and then he moved to Baltimore. Everybody, I mean, I kept reading in different newspapers, in different magazines, that he was from Slavic background, or and some actually stated that he was from Irish background. So I thought, okay, so what I would do every time I came across a fighter where there was like conflicting information, I would put them on a piece of paper, requires further research. So I came across Tommy Daly, and then one day I came across an article in the National Police Gazette, and there it says Tommy Daly, his real name Thomas Brescia, but Brescia is spelt with a suffix. So I'm thinking, okay, that doesn't sound Italian. About 2 weeks later, I make a trip to the Gazzetta dello Sport archives in Milan, which is the big Italian sports newspaper. I go over there, go through their archives. I come across Tommy Daly, his real name, Tommaso Brescia. Brescia spelt the Italian way, Brescia. And I'm like, wow, I've had to travel to another country, check out the archives to find out the guy's true identity. And there I found out that Tommy Daly was born in southern Italy. I found out his real birthplace, found out his real name. And, and I'd read all of these American archives and I never once found his true identity. In fact, some of these American newspapers listed him as being from Irish or Slavic background. And so it was things like that happened more than once. I'm just citing you one example, otherwise I could spend hours telling you about the various names that I uncovered by doing it. Yes, for me it was just the compiling of all this data and putting it down and listing it as one project, and then obviously writing it. I enjoyed writing it all together and seeing it come together. Yeah, very proud of the book. I have to say, it's taken a long time to bring it all together, but a lot of hard work, and but I think it's been worth it. I'm very pleased with it. I just hope that your viewers are the same way about it.
You certainly should be proud of it because it's a great read. And just to keep going, did you get an opportunity to either meet in person or through correspondence, like some relatives of some of these fighters that were surprised to even hear that they were fighters, or the complete opposite, knew that they were there, whoever the relative was a fighter, and that there's interest in him? I mean, I'm sure you came across some of those situations.
Yeah, no, I mean, what's happened is since the book, what I found regarding that specific question, since the book has come out, I've been contacted by Pete Herman's grandson, which was quite something. He read the book, and he was excited to see that his father was photographed on the front cover of the book, and he was telling me that he was telling me he's never actually seen in any document in America, because he's working on some kind of project to bring to life the life story of Pete Herman, who was a wonderful bantamweight boxer back in the bantamweight champion back in 1917. I think he regained his title from Joe Lynch in 21. So, and he was telling me that they're trying to negotiate rights for a film about his dad. And he contacted me when he saw my book, and just confirmed that he had never seen his father's real name printed in the national press until he read my book. And he asked me, he goes, "How did you know that my father's name, his real name, was Pietro Gullotta? I mean, the surname has been banded around, but he's always been known as Peter Gullotta." And I said, "Well, when I was in Italy, I managed to find in the archives some biographical information about your dad, and he was listed as Pietro." And he said, "That's fabulous, because a lot of people, he's never been listed as that in America." So that was fabulous. I've also Sammy Fuller's granddaughter from Boston also has touched base as a result of the book. So that's gratifying. I've also been in contact with, I think it's his grandson, Battling Battolino, the featherweight champion from 1929. So he's been in contact, and he says he's going to. I think he's in the process of trying to dig out some more information that he wants to throw my way. So that's great. I've also been in touch with Peter Marciano, Rocky's brother. Mm-hmm. Who's also aware of the book. So yeah, I mean, that's gratifying. I mean, I hoped through the book that that the relatives of of these champions, claimants, and contenders realised that these weren't just um, boxers. These were champions. These were great American sports people that, for some reason, either because they changed their names, or because they've been erased from memory because through the sands of time. I don't know, but I think a lot of the feedback that I'm getting from these relatives is that they're very happy. They're very, they're very happy that someone has decided to remember these heroes and hard men from the past. And I'm glad that I could be of service.
Well, I certainly hope that you and I get a chance to talk some more, because I would love to sit and chat with you for hours, because this is right up my alley. The Real Rockies. Where can people get your book? I have it up in front of the camera right now. The normal places, where can they get it?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment it's available online via www.amazon.com. That is the best route. It's also available from a retailer called www.ypdbooks.com. But it's an online. It's basically available through online retailers. I'm trying to negotiate with some American distributors to try and get it in the usual outlets like Barnes and Noble, but that's not available at the moment. But as soon as that information, as soon as that becomes available, I'll let you know, Billy. But at the moment, it's available through the Amazon.com route.
It sounds good. So anybody that wants to pick up a copy of The Real Rockies, check out www.amazon.com. And like Rolando said, if I get you any updates, we will definitely talk about that. Rolando, I appreciate your time. I enjoyed the book. I recommend to all my viewers and listeners to pick up a copy of this book. And I will be in touch with you, my man, because I think that I would love to schedule some time to chat with you in depth about some of these specific fighters, for sure.
It will be my pleasure, Billy, and thank you very much for having me on your show.
No problem. I hope to have you on again, man. Maybe you can give us a follow-up if you find any other information that might be pertinent to this book.
Absolutely.
All right, my man. Have a good one.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. That's Rolando Vitale writing the book, The Real Rockies. Great read, man. And let me tell you something. Not only is the story good, and it's a quick read, by the way. The meat of the book is about 150 pages or whatever. But then the appendices that I was talking about with Rolando earlier, it just captivates you, man. You gotta get yourself a copy of it right now on Amazon.com. The Real Rockies. The author's last name is spelled Vitale, Vitale, Vitale. If you want to do a search, the title. The Real Rockies, a history of the golden age of Italian Americans in boxing from 1900 through 1955. I recommend the book big time, and I will be in touch with Rolando to get him to send us a JPEG so we can put this up in the book club as well. So make sure you get yourself a copy of that. I'm a little past my break. I'm going to take it right now. When I come back, I got some more news to talk about. I don't know if we'll have a chance to open up the phone lines or not, but I got plenty of stuff to talk about, and all of that is coming up in about 2.
If you want